pegs. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for this session that's organised by the TSI Network, the Third Sector Employability Forum, or TSEF, as it's more commonly known, and Social Enterprise Scotland. It's to provide an introduction on service design and employability, and I know it's going to be a fascinating session. I'm Jane, I'm the membership manager here at Social Enterprise Scotland, and I also sit on the exec group with TSEF, and I've had a long-standing interest in employability. Some of you will know we've been running a series of thematic workshops around employability. We've had hugely positive feedback on them. So if you've missed any of them, you can catch up with them on our YouTube channel. And there's upcoming sessions as well. And I'll post those in the chat as we go through the session or towards the end of the session. Just to say, normal Zoom rules apply. So if you can keep yourself on mute while we go through the presentation, there will be time for questions. You can pop the questions in the chat. And please do use the chat to say hello, to say where you're from, both in terms of your organisation and your geography, because that's always quite nice to know. Got brilliant speakers today, really looking forward to the session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pegs, who's going to steer us through the session. Pegs, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jane, and welcome everybody. Yeah, you'll be pleased to know you won't be hearing so much from me, but actually much more from Maja, whose surname I've never actually tried to pronounce, I've just realised, Community Engagement Lead at Glasgow CVS, and Christina, who I've worked with very closely for a long time from the Lived Experience team of Fife Voluntary Action. We're going to talk a little bit about what service design is, why it matters, some examples of people applying this methodology in the employability context, some of the things that are important for you to take into consideration as you may move forward on your service design journey, and then end with some tools and resources. So yeah, if you're saying hi in the chat, do you tell us how things are where you are as well? We love to know, is it sunny? Is it rainy? What's going on in your world? So please feel free to pop that in. If we go to the next slide, I'm just going to talk very briefly about why this stuff matters to us in the context of No One Left Behind. I'm just realizing that my toolbar is making it so that I can't actually see the stuff that I need to see. One more click for me. So hopefully most of you you've been working in employability and you are familiar with No One Left Behind as our policy context and framework for doing employability work and funding that in Scotland. These are the 7 key principles which kind of underpin No One Left Behind. They've been there since the beginning and they still stand strong and critical to the conversation around service design is this last point which I've highlighted, that the expectation is that our planning, our thinking, our work around commissioning locally relevant, person-centred employability services is that should be driven by evidence, including not just the usual data that we might kind of familiarly refer to, but the experience of users. And service design provides us a really useful frame for doing that and doing that meaningfully and well. So I'm going to hand over to Maja, who has been working in this field for a significant period of time, and she is going to talk you through a little bit more about what service design is. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so I wanted to preface this by saying we do at GCVS run a training session about service design, the Scottish approach to service design specifically, and co-design, and it takes a whole day and there's still plenty to discuss at the end. So this is very much a whistle-stop tour. We hope it gives you a good idea, a flavour of what this is about and some things to explore in the future. First of all, I'll take you through a framework that kind of forms the backbone of a design thinking or a service design process. It's called the double diamond. And as the name suggests, it's formed of 2 beautiful diamonds. And it takes us from finding an opportunity all the way through to delivering something. And the way it's split, a good way I find of thinking about it is the first diamond is about designing the right thing, making sure that we're focusing our energies in the right places, Whereas the second diamond is about kind of the quality of our ideas and our solutions. And in my experience, it's the first diamond that doesn't get enough love. It tends to get skipped quite often. And I think it makes sense, like as humans, we're quite solutions and ideas focused creatures, and that's really wonderful. But I'll cover in just a second why I think that first diamond is so important. So I'll take us through it kind of step by step. Like I said, we start off with an opportunity, and this could really be just anything that acts as a starting point for this process. It could be that you're creating a new service. It could be that you're improving an existing one. If you're brave, you can call it a problem that you're trying to solve, or an opportunity that you're trying to pursue. And we start off our first diamond with this kind of like diverging phase. And it's all about kind of understanding the problem that we're up against, understanding whether actually maybe in itself it's a symptom of an issue that's a bit deeper down, and getting a really good sense of it. And this is a really, really important step. One of the sort of tools that you can employ here, it's just asking why over and over and over again, also known as the 5 whys. And I've got a bit of an example that we use in our training session about the impact that this kind of approach can make. So in this example, let's say you've identified an opportunity to improve volunteer retention. You've noticed that a lot of volunteers are leaving, and you want to find out what you can do about it. So if you weren't familiar with the double diamond, maybe you'd put out a survey to people that have stopped volunteering. Let's just assume that like GDPR lets you do this for the sake of argument, but you ask everyone that's left, why is it that you don't volunteer with us anymore? And maybe what people tell you is they just didn't have time for it anymore. And where do you go from there? Obviously, there's not a lot that you can do about that. But with sort of service design approaches in your toolbox, it might look a little bit different. So maybe if you like invest time into that problem discovery phase, maybe you get face-to-face with people or get people on the phone and start having conversations with them to really dig deeper. Your conversation might go a little bit like this. So they start off by telling you they don't have time, and you try to get an understanding for why that is. Obviously, where it says why, don't actually ask them why, but maybe dress it up in nicer words. But maybe they tell you that it's because they wanted to prioritize other activities. And if you try to understand why it is that they wanted to prioritize those activities, maybe they tell you that they were really beneficial for their mental health. And okay, so let's go with that, and let's try to understand like what it is about those things that was helpful for their mental health. Maybe they tell you that they felt like part of the community. And if you try to understand that, maybe it was about actually feeling valued and appreciated. And that's just 4. That's just 4 of the 5 whys, but already you might find yourself with new avenues to explore. So maybe you can ask them, well, did you feel valued and appreciated whilst volunteering here? And so we've gone from something that we have no influence over into something that maybe we can do something about. And moving us on within the double diamond, the next phase, we've kind of diverged, we've explored the problem, and often we uncover a lot of complexity, a lot of kind of branching problems and symptoms and causes, and we can't solve everything at once, and it can get quite overwhelming. So it's quite important to pick an area that we want to focus in. And this can be based on things that we have influence over, things that are priorities for us. And this is really, really important so that we don't get too overwhelmed. And in between the 2 diamonds, we've got a bit of a step that's a bridge. It basically captures everything from the first diamond, so the challenge and our focus within that challenge. And it provides a nice jumping off point for the second diamond that's phrased in quite like an actionable way that can already sort of go a long way to spark some ideas. And we call this a how might we question. So if we think about our previous example, let's say we did decide to focus on that feeling of being valued and appreciated by volunteers, our how might we question might sound like, well, how might we ensure that our volunteers feel valued and appreciated? So it's much broader than how might we, much more specific than how might we stop so many volunteers from leaving, but it's also not so specific that it jumps into solutions, because that's what the second diamond's about. So again, we start with this diverging phase. It's about gathering as many ideas as possible, building on those ideas, and really not limiting yourself at this point, kind of blue skies thinking. Because what comes next is another sort of converging phase. So you want to make sure you've got the full breadth of what you can gather in the first phase, so you've got a lot of choice and a lot of avenues to explore. But in this phase, you're really trying to think, well, out of all of those great ideas that we've gathered, which ones should we implement? And you can find this out through prototyping them, testing, gathering feedback, and iterating on them. And that should help you sort of assess the feasibility and how effective they are. And because of everything that you've done, hopefully by the time it comes to delivering something, you've got a solution that focuses in the right place and is kind of fit for purpose. So you implement that and evaluate it. And as suggested here through the evaluation, there's a couple of notes I want to make on the double diamond. And the first one is that, like, unfortunately, it doesn't end there. It's not once and done. It's kind of an ongoing process and a bit of a mindset that's about, you know, continuously looking for those opportunities to improve. My service design lecturer always used to say, everything is always in beta. And I think that just reflects that, you know, we're dealing with a landscape that's changing. We're dealing with people's needs that are changing as well. So let's stay flexible to that. And the other point that I wanted to make here is that even though this feels quite like neat and straightforward, a lot of the time when you're in it and you're doing it, it feels a lot more like this. And that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It probably just means that you're engaging with the sort of breadth of complexity that's there. So I really wanted to stress that the double diamond is a tool in your toolbox. If it helps you navigate things and find your way within the process, great, but don't bend over backwards to try and fit your work in exactly, because a lot of the time you end up kind of going back and forth between stages and it's never quite as simple in practice. So that was the double diamond, and it's quite versatile. It's quite a versatile approach. It's used across sectors. It's quite often used in the private sector. People use it to build apps and other other like for-profit activity. But I guess, you know, if we wanted to contextualize it for our kind of work, I think the Scottish approach to service design is really relevant. Obviously, first of all, it contextualizes it within Scotland, but also in the context of public services. And although it's written from a kind of like public sector perspective, I think it's also really, really relevant for the third sector. Obviously, we deliver public services and often collaborate with the public sector, and a lot of it is transferable as well. But before we jump into the Scottish approach to service design, I wanted to stop talking for a minute and get a bit of a show of hands from yourselves. So if I could, either if you're on camera, give me a wave. If you're not, you can use the react buttons at the bottom of your screen. But just to get an idea, if you could put your hand up if you think that we should try to understand a problem before we look at solutions. Seeing some waves and some thumbs up. Wonderful. Okay, and if I could get you to put your hand up if you think that people are experts in their lived experience. Again, lots of lovely faces waving at me. Wonderful. Thank you. And if I could get you to keep your hand up if you think we should try to engage with people at the earliest opportunity and not just get them to pick between different solutions that we've come up with. Again, lots of people waving at me, some thumbs up. Wonderful, thank you. And lastly, if I could get you to put your hand up if you think that when we engage with people, we should make sure that how we do that is inclusive, accessible, and meaningful. Wonderful, thank you, everyone. Okay, so if you've put your hand up for those, I should have really asked at the start whether the Scottish approach to service design is something you were familiar with. But regardless if it was, you can congratulate yourself because many of you are clearly already working in line with the Scottish approach to service design and I guess embodying those approaches. So congrats to you. You can please don't leave. We've got more to tell you about. Right. So the Scottish approach to service design, this is how the Scottish government defines it. So is a vision that the people of Scotland are supported and empowered to actively participate in the definition, design, and delivery of public services. So all the way from policy making to live service improvement. And much like No One Left Behind, it's captured through 7 principles. So the 7 principles are, and I've reworded them slightly for the hands up activity, but the first one's about looking at the problem before we design solutions. The second one is about designing service journeys around people and not how the public sector is organized. So for me, this is about putting lived experience at the center of how we do things over our kind of like internal structures. The third one is about getting people involved right from the start of that service design process. The fourth one is about being inclusive and making sure that when we engage with people, that is accessible, that they're able to participate fully and meaningfully. The fifth one is about using tools. There are so many brilliant resources and methods that can be found out there. We'll sort of signpost you to some of those towards the end. The sixth one is about kind of sharing data and insights. And I guess within the community engagement space, we talk a lot about engagement fatigue, and I think this links in. So making sure that we use what we already know. We're not asking people the same questions over and over again. And yes, absolutely, we can just use that as the starting point and sense check it and say, is this still right? But it's important that it doesn't go unacknowledged. And lastly, it's about building methods, tools, and a community. So sharing learning, and I hope that today is one of the opportunities to do that and that you'll find plenty in the future as well. So for me, to kind of summarize the Scottish approach to service design, these are the 4 that really, really stand out. So looking at the problem before you look at solutions, knowing that people are experts in their lived experience and really, really valuing that, and getting their participation right from the start of the process and doing so in inclusive, accessible, and meaningful ways. And for me, if I really think about service design versus the Scottish approach to service design, for me, the Scottish approach really places that emphasis on participation and getting people involved in the process. So now that I've covered the basics, I'm going to pass to Christina, who's going to tell us all about why it's important and give us some first-hand experience. Over to you, Christina.
Hello. So first of all, I'd like to take a little bit of a break from that amazing part of the presentation. And we have a little activity. And I would like everyone to take about a minute to think about what you think of when it comes to the word spring. Don't write anything in the chat for now. I would like you to think of 3 words on how it makes you feel, what you think of, what you relate it to, and I'll give you about a minute to come up with that. And then once it's over, if you could write those 3 words in the chat, but keep it to yourself for now. Off you go. I'll give you a sound effect there. There we go. So if y'all could, oh, here we go. Thank you for starting it off. If you can all just put in how you feel about spring. boiling energy. So as you can see, all of those coming in, which are thankfully quite a breadth in so many different points of views. So the point of that was that everybody's different when it comes to their lived experience and or their professional experience or their experience in leadership. They come in different perspectives, but there's also a commonality here. As you can see, there's a lot of similar words getting thrown in. There might be similar feelings, but you're using different words to explain that. And that's really important when it comes to involving people with lived experience and creating a service or redesigning an old one, and that everybody needs to remember that we're coming at it from different angles. So yeah, that was just a little to show you that. Next slide. Okay, so Maja will touch on this a bit later, but obviously my co-production triangle that has been through various iterations is just one way to do service design. And if you want to know more about co-production and all of that, I'm sure you can all link in with the Scottish Co-production Network, which has a breadth of knowledge and resources on that. But for today, I just wanted to show it for the purpose of emphasising this little green triangle here, which is involving people with lived experience. I also like to note that you might find that you might fit in one or more. You might fit in all three, depending on what hats you are bringing to the session that you're in or workshop. That's just a little bit about that. So my story and why involving people with lived experience matters. I'd like to give some context on where I was at the start of this journey of being in the third sector and using my lived experience as a way to help change policy and change services. So in 2017, my mental health took a huge dip. I was at the very bottom. I moved back in with my parents. I dropped out of university. I didn't have a job. It was all very dark and glum for a long time. I managed to get counselling and therapy and started to get myself well again. And during that journey, I obviously signed on to Universal Credit. And that experience was both negative and positive. So when I got there, I was very, very lucky that my job coach was probably one in a million. She realised that I was in a similar position to her in the past, and really gave me time to breathe, such as she used to book me in at lunchtimes because it meant that other clients weren't in. And at that time, I had a lot of social anxiety, and being around other people made me nervous. I wouldn't open up as much if there was prying eyes on me. She also would book me in for doubles. So like instead of 10 minutes, we'd have 20 minutes because sometimes it would take me 5 or 10 minutes to be able to actually articulate my words. So there were certain things, little details that she did that really, really helped my journey. And one of the big factors was that I was on limited capability, which meant that I wasn't like threatened with sanctions should I have not looked for work. I wasn't required to go in every 2 weeks, even though my job coach pushed me to come in every 2 weeks. It was mainly about a personal outcome. It was about me getting on the bus, me being able to learn how to speak to people again and get outside. And all of those things I believe are inherently important when it comes to being in employment and you managing to stay in that job. So yeah, when about 2019, when I'd done my counselling and I was ready to maybe start volunteering or maybe go into work, we had this one conversation that always stands out, and it's, Christina, what do you actually like to do? Like, is there something so left field, out the park, that you can maybe take on to be like a career or a job that you've never really thought of? And again, because I was on limited capability, I had this time to breathe. I had this time to think and not be stressed about any other circumstances that were happening and all of that. And I realised that I still do. And it's I like to give feedback. And I'm the person that emails Amazon when a button isn't working. I'm the person that reviews a Sky advert because they might have said something that could be triggering to neurodivergence or mental health or whatever. That's me. I am the annoying person that gives customer feedback. So from that one conversation kind of snowballed with the support worker that I also had at the time. And we cut to 2019 where that support worker got an email through. Pegs can correct me if it's a bit hazy on the details because it was so long ago. An email came through for her to bring a client to a session on the No One Left Behind commissioning framework for the Fife specifically. So she asked me, she was like, look, there's this session that I've been invited to. I've been asked to bring a client. Are you comfortable with it? It is totally up your street about giving your experiences that you had going through counselling and the DWP. If you want to attend and not say anything, that's fine. And if you do, even better. So I attended that. I managed to speak up a few times. I was still in a not a very good place, but I was definitely getting better. I was excited again for to go back into work or volunteer, maybe not quite work at that time. So yeah, that was such an enlightening experience. But then, of course, 2020, the pandemic hits. That was fortunately a positive experience for me. All the conversations that were going to be taking part with that project that Pegs was running was all moved on to online. So I wasn't quite ready for rooms and rooms full of people. So that was like a really good thing for me that it moved online. I could be in the comfort of my own home and give all my opinions and ideas and feedback about the services that I had used. So I'd obviously used unemployment services and mental health services. What these conversations did was give me my voice back. I felt incredibly valued in these conversations. There were a mixture of decision makers and delivery partners, people with lived experience, all in these meetings. And there was never one time that I ever felt that somebody had more power over me in these conversations. It was a genuine environment of learning and creativity and being like, we want to get this right. And I've always said that to this day. And what happened during that was there was a lot of sharing of vulnerability. I was able to talk to people again and use these like horrible experiences of my mental health and unemployment to actually better the services in Fife. And that was such a huge thing for me. And once again, I felt incredibly valued by the end of it. Respected. I was given the space and the time to articulate what I was trying to say. So from there, Pigs and Anne Fearful at the time, who was the lived experience team coordinator, asked me to volunteer with the lived experience team here at Fife Voluntary Action. And what we did with No One Left Behind was sort of not replicated, but we got involved in various other projects that had the same vein, that had the same values, at least within the team. And we wanted to make sure that we got that message out that involving people with lived experience matters. And if you're going to make a service, who best to ask on how that service is run than the people that use them. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And success story, I believe. I am now employed by Fife Voluntary Action. That first started part-time. Again, these inherent values of respect and honesty and integrity were all really taken into consideration because I was upfront about my mental health. I never ever felt like it was like I was getting special treatment or certain things were condescending, because Pegs definitely gave the workout when she was a team leader. So yeah, I was part-time. I went into full-time a year later. I'm still here. So that was from 2022 and it is now 2025. All that experience, my going through the services, unemployment, go into that one meeting to snowball into trying to help the voices of lived experience get their say in service creation and service design. It just made me really passionate about something that I know is on the no one left behind principles, which is right time, right person, right job. And no matter how much time that takes, for me, it was 2017 to 2022. But what I did in that time was make those positive steps to get to this point. And I think that's really what it's all about. And then again, Maya, I think Maya and Pegs will talk on a bit more about it, but it definitely has all the values, so willingness to learn, curiosity, openness, humility, trust and integrity, and awareness of power. And what I kind of want to leave you with is that it's important because it involves everybody learning. Everybody is open in the room, regardless of your job title, regardless of your experiences. You're all there with a shared common goal to be able to better a service in Fife and do it. And one of my huge moral codes it's concrete, is integrity. If it turns out to be a mess, it turns out to be a mess. But if you're all there for the same reason and you feel that, I think that is just, it's so important, regardless if you get the project off its feet or not. It's the intention that you have when you get there. So yeah, that's why I think it matters. Next slide. And this quote specifically, I think, is just one of the most important quotes in Beyond Sticky Notes, which I 100% recommend, and it will be on the resources list towards the end. And it is, when we make decisions on behalf of other people, we assume we understand their dreams, needs, experience, and capacities, or lack thereof. In doing that, we overlook their knowledge and skills. And for me, my job experience and my qualifications have zero to do with what I do now. I gained most of my confidence and my skills through volunteering and through these conversations that we have about lived experience and creating services, whether it's designing a new one or redesigning an old one. So yeah, I hope that was good for you all, and I will pass back on.
Thanks, Christina. Super to just remembering the journey is quite we kind of forget when we're working together now. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. If we go on to the next slide, I guess one of the things that is, well, why does this matter particularly in employability? And for me, this slide kind of captures a lot of that. You know, in employability, we tend to talk about the pipeline originally. I think, you know, now we might talk about the pathway a bit more, even more recently, maybe talking about a bit of an ecosystem about how do we create employability services which are a bit more complexity friendly. But when I first started out on this journey, it felt very much like, you know, I was in a room full of people with a 5-stage pathway going, oh no, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Stage 4, stage 5, they get a job, and we do all of these different things at these different points, and you know, and there was me at the door, kind of looking, going, I just think it's a bit more complicated than that. And the No One Left Behind co-production work that we did, which Christina so importantly supported, really emphasised that for us. You know, when we heard about and talked to everybody that was involved in employability, whether they were doing that as a service from a perspective of someone using services or someone delivering services or a strategic planner, actually we all began to realise that it is incredibly complex and messy, and everybody's journey to work, when we actually look at it and think about it, is utterly unique and is continually changing depending on their internal context and the factors which relate to themselves, whether that's confidence, motivation, knowledge, life experiences, but also external context, things like the availability of jobs, transport, childcare, health services, and so on. So we need to start moving and thinking differently about what we do when we're commissioning and planning our employability services, and try and kind of recognise this complexity. And the other thing that came through from that Fife work was that when we start working, when we were really listening to and engaging and hearing from people that were using services and working together, it became really clear that whilst what we deliver matters within the services, how we delivered things mattered far more, or as much, let's say. So, it's all very well doing an action plan with somebody, but there are about 10 million thousand ways of doing an action plan with somebody, and only a few of those are going to leave that person walking out feeling empowered to navigate their own life. So this kind of idea of co-production and service design can happen at the front line as well as all the way up. So if we come on to the next slide, and I'm actually really pleased because we were so worried we weren't going to have enough time to get through everything, but we're on point. So I'm going to talk a little bit less rapidly and take a bit more of a breath. So we wanted to talk a little bit about different examples of ways that people have been doing service design work in employability in Scotland, because there are lots and lots and lots of different ways to approach this work. So this is just 4 examples. I'm sure there are other things happening that I'm not aware of, but these are the 4 that I'm most familiar with. And you will, as I talk through them, you'll see that they each have worked very differently. So I'll start with Fife because that's the one that I'm kind of most familiar with. So in Fife, as Christina said, we as the third sector interface, we've got funding from the LEP to kind of facilitate some co-production work to identify what we wanted to do with No One Left Behind monies when it was coming through and how we might want to work differently around that. The thing that was critical for us was we had a co-produced steering group, if you like, which brought together, as Christina said, people who were using services, people that were delivering services, as well as a couple of strategic leads from a range of different perspectives, local authority, third sector, and so on. And we worked collaboratively to actually plan the whole engagement. So we designed the survey together, we designed the workshops together, we identified the things that we thought would be important to be asking people, and then we analysed and considered the findings together as well. And really the outputs of that were a really kind of subtle but critical shift in how we went about commissioning services, and this emphasis on the quality and the print. We co-created some principles for service delivery about non-judgment and so on that were as important as the content of what was getting delivered. And we created a lived experience panel that would help support bids or help assess bids and help contribute to the assessment of what was going to get funded. And we got lived experience representation on the oversight group, which Christina fulfilled that function for a long time and was very fantastic at holding everyone to account and keeping our feet firmly on the ground, which is really useful, as I'm sure some of you will know. So that's kind of how things have worked in Fife. In Orkney, the local authority actually, through their community learning and development team, brought together a group of volunteers initially to help plan a community hub that was going to be around employment stuff, and they wanted advice and to kind of work collaboratively to design and plan that, what needed to go in it. But that was such an amazing process, and there was so much learning for everybody involved that the volunteers that were involved wanted to continue, and so did the local authority wanted to continue that relationship. So they named themselves the Jedi Council. Now, that's been around for quite a few years now, so there's been an iteration and a turnover of the people that are involved in it, but they've also got involved in lots of other employability related pieces of work, so mapping local provision, creating a directory and a pathway of resources, and so on. And they're now an official subgroup of their local employability partnership and have a rotating space for 2 representatives on the LEP board. So that's kind of what's happened there. In Glasgow, and I think Alison's on the call, so she can correct me if I get any of this wrong, but Glasgow and Lucky, they've got something called the Centre for Civic Innovation. It's all about doing this kind of work. So they have supported a whole programme of work around employability with a service design lens, using a combination of surveys, focus groups, and face-to-face sessions. And quite a lot of recommendations came out of that. Probably the most kind of relevant right now is around looking at lived experience involvement in employability and beginning to pilot ideas or developing ideas for piloting around that. And actually that makes me think back to Maja's beautiful service design model. You don't necessarily have to end up with one idea that you want to take forward. There can be lots, especially in the complex world of employability. So it's okay to kind of think, no, there's multiple problems here, and actually we might be developing and testing multiple solutions. And then finally in Dumfries and Galloway, again, the community learning and development team have taken a place-based approach. So they identified first one and then another locality where really persistent levels of poverty and deprivation were occurring, and nothing seemed to be shifting it. And then working with the Service Design Academy and local third sector organisations, and using community consultants, so training community consultants, they undertook surveys, door-to-door engagements, and drop-in sessions. And that information then was fed in to coming up with ideas and solutions, and everybody was involved in that process. The outcome of those, the two place-based approaches which have happened so far, is the creation of some local hubs, but with different balances and flavours in terms of what the content of support and provision is in them, and how they're kind of promoted and communicated about, relevant to the needs of the area. So I suppose what you can see from that is that, when it comes to things like service design, it can happen at a kind of strategic commissioning level, which is like what we did in Fife. It can be focused around very specific projects, which is how things started in Orkney. It can be a big picture conversation like they had in Glasgow, or it can get very, very place-based and actually focus on a community of need rather than a kind of specific policy area. And all of those are totally valid and applicable. And I think what we're going to do in a moment is we'll pause for questions about what we've done so far. Then we're going to have a little bit of a break. And when we come back, Maja's then going to talk a little bit more about this, what we might call the spectrum of engagement, the different ways that you can kind of move forward in doing this work, and what that involves, and some of the things that it's important to consider. But maybe we'll just open the floor now for either reflections in the chat or questions. Please be brave. You can put your hand up if you want to unmute. That's also totally fine. Tell us what you think, or if there's any questions you have. Emma.
Hello, I'm Emma from Change Mental Health from Dumfries. My question wasn't really a question, it was just really a reflection on one of the terms you used about moving from the pipeline approach, which seems very, very fixed and rigid, and kind of pathway to it, and like an ecosystem, which sounds a lot more aligned to where people are in their lives, and how it doesn't have to be a rigid, like 12 weeks you're going to have a job. And I like the feel for a person-centered approach, that lived experience, and the time is of the essence, and it's really having the personal pace, which is really important. So I like the ecosystem terminology. So thank you for that, Pegs.
Well, that's great. I'm all over it. I'm very keen. And one of the interesting things, I'll come to you in a minute, Kim, but just to reflect on that point about things happening at people's own pace. So one of the things that came through from our No One Left Behind work in Fife was that sometimes that time pressure actually slowed people down on their journey to work. So the sense of, I have to get to this outcome by this point, oh my God, the panic that kind of came with that, then actually made it harder for people to move forward. And I think this is a really important thing, we also know that some people sometimes get a bit stuck, and there are people who maybe move from service to service to service to service, or who just are really, for some reason, really struggling to move forward. So there's one of the strategic partners, I think, was like, well, we can't just have endless, and also you can have workers who can babysit people, that can also happen. There's a little bit of a, oh no, but they're not ready yet, but they're not, but yeah. So one of the things that I think is really important, if you're going to have a kind of an open time frame, is that there is really strong support and supervision for the staff members who are working in that way. So there is space for them to reflect on the practices that they're having, how they're working with a client or with an individual, and if they have been working with someone for a long period of time, some support to try and think about what maybe could be happening differently in that space. So actually really kind of investing in that reflective space for the frontline staff, not creating unnecessary targets, but valuing that understanding that everyone's journey is unique, and therefore our key workers are exceptional beings and need the space and support to really kind of think about what they're doing with each of the people they're working with. Kim.
Yeah, thank you very much to all the presenters for really enlightening presentations. Thank you. I'm interested in the co-production and hearing from lived experience. In fact, the whole process obviously involves a lot of conversations and communications between lots and lots of different people. And I just wondered what's the recommended approach, or what approach do you take to making sure all those communications are communication inclusive, both in your whole process of service design, but also just generally recommending in the employability space. I'm interested, for example, you're just talking about time, that situational factor, how long people need, when it's best for them, is a really key aspect of communication inclusion. But yeah, I'm just interested in the inclusive communication practices that you employ in your service design, or you recommend, rather.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Maja might come in on this as well, but I think a couple of the things that we did in Fife, recognizing that we were doing it during lockdown, because the first lockdown as well, so we were all a bit like, we partnered with Fife Centre for Equalities to help us make sure that and they came on the steering group, and so we did kind of shared training with all the steering group and the facilitators to help us understand how to do things as inclusively as possibly could. And then we also did, we worked with what we term trusted partner organisations to get in reach to communities that we knew would not necessarily come forward to a kind of mainstream session. So at the time there was Pink Saltire and Fife, or we worked with, can't remember the disability specific organisation now, it's gone out of my head. But you know, so we did sort of, we did that. And I think that was really important, just recognising that we needed to go to where people were, even if it was electronically, but be a bit more proactive. And then we tracked that. So we did equalities tracking for everything to make sure that we could understand if there were key perspectives we were missing. But in terms of actual tools, we were quite limited because we were just online. So all we could do was keep it as simple as we possibly could and not use Miro boards or any of those other things that, you know, were beginning to float around. But Maja and Christina, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add to that.
Yeah, it's not really part of what we're going to be saying later, and I've just remembered it's quite important. During a bigger project that we took part in that is just finished, it was with the Fife Health and Social Care Partnership, and we went out to communities and did collaborative conversations where we were gathering information and research on how people felt about mental health services, what they would like to see, what is the things that they might not realise actually contributes to their mental health, like parks. Fife is such a rich area to live. But what was the most important for us in those sessions, they were 4 hours long, but 2 of the hours were made up of condition building. So it was about everybody being trusted in their, so we set up, this was all in person. We set up all the tables and everybody at that table stayed there. So for the whole 4 hours, they were with each other. They built this sense of trust and companionship, I suppose, for the session itself. And we just felt like that was the most important thing that came out of it. You got the best feedback. People opened up more if you spent that time building conditions.
Thanks, Christina. I'd forgotten about how important that was, and you're so right. Yes. Maja, is there anything you'd want to bring in?
I think yeah, great points mentioned already. Like I guess if it's a specific minority group you're trying to reach, working with people that work with them, because they'll know what works with that group, right? And I guess what I was going to say is, you know, at risk of doing engagement about doing engagement about doing engagement, ask people what they need in terms of communications, because everyone's needs will be different. And I will touch about on it a little bit later, but it's a huge topic, and we could probably spend an hour and a half just talking about how we make engagement inclusive. And it's so important that we do, right? Because if we don't, then the voices that we hear are already voices of people that, you know, have certain privileges because they're able to make it. And then so actually what we find out runs the risk of not, you know, working against inequalities and tackling them, but actually perpetrates them. So it's such an important conversation, but it's one that could go on forever probably. But great question.
I'd love to help with that conversation. Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's something about the bringing people in and having that collaborative steering group, or that kind of that discussion together about how you're even going to do the engagement, is so critical, because so often we see that, you know, where people come up with the questions, but it's a load of professionals that have come up with questions and they're not the right questions, and they're not being asked in ways which are actually kind of creating a common understanding. They're still sort of perpetuating othering, completely unintentionally. So yeah, I think that one of the biggest things for me is if you can get a collaborative steering group, you're probably winning half of your battles. Any other questions or reflections? I'm not keeping an eye on the chat. It's not all just about daffodils. Hang on. Oh, somebody was experiencing problems with the sound. Is it okay now for you, Angela? Hopefully it is.
Yeah, I think it's mine because it's temperamental pegs. It's fine now, but it's in and out. So,
okay. Sorry about that. Any other questions people would like to ask? No? In that case, what we thought we'd do, we'd give everybody just a 5-minute comfort break. We can make it 8 minutes and then we'll come back at 3 o'clock and start the next half. Is that okay? So I don't know if you can pause recording, Jane. Going on to the second half now, and this is a bit more about the diverse ways that you might get involved in this kind of work, and also some important things to kind of bear in mind about how we come into this kind of work. So I'll hand over to Maja.
Thanks, Pix. So I wanted to start with this because I think it's a really helpful framework when we think about this stuff. It's just one version of a participation spectrum. You might be familiar with a slightly different version called a ladder. This is the one I use, but they're all good to think about. But for today, we'll be using this one. And really the point I wanted to make here is that each rung of the participation spectrum goes along with a different promise that we are making to the people whose participation it is that we're seeking. So inform is pretty straightforward. They don't really get a say. When we consult on top of informing them, we say we will listen, and then we may or may not include what you told us in the decisions that we make, but we'll let you know. Involve is a little bit more of a promise to work together and actually reflect people's input in what we decide and develop. Collaborate, I think this sort of veers into like partnership working and working as equals more, making decisions together, coming up with solutions together. So Christina's co-production triangle, where we've got those different groups of people in the room together, working together, I think sits in here. And then finally, we've got empower, which is where we're saying, you decide, we'll help you make it happen, but the decision is yours. And service design can happen almost anywhere on the spectrum. Obviously, we might need to do a little bit more than just tell people what's happening, as you hopefully got a good idea from the first hour of this. We do want to get people's participation, but that participation can sit anywhere from consult to empower, basically. And as we move up the spectrum, what we find is that there is more power that is being shared by those who have those specific forms of power, people that are able to make decisions about services, and that power is being shared with the participants or citizens or the community or people with lived experience, whatever works for the context that you're working with. And when we talk about power in this context, I think often we can have quite negative connotations of the word power, but really all we mean here is the ability to affect an outcome. And we've heard from Christina why it's so important and how meaningful it can be when we share this power and get people involved and people can see the impact that their contributions are making. But we won't pretend that sharing power is easy, because it's not. It's not. But hopefully you can have some good thinking points, because what we hope to leave you with is some reflections on what you can do in your role to support empowering design. And I wanted to add a note here about the word empowering, because a lot of people struggle with this word, because it could be seen as implying that people with lived experience or communities don't have power unless we empower them, which is not true. But I think what we have to acknowledge is that when we bring these people into our world of work, the power balance isn't equal. And that's really important in this context. So when we're thinking about, well, what can we do to support this kind of work? I think it's helpful to first think of what role we have in this landscape. So again, I'm bringing back the participation triangle and just maybe getting you to reflect a little bit on where you sit within this. So is it that you're in a leadership in a strategic decision-making role? So in the purple area, is it that actually, I think these next two roles sit maybe somewhere in the middle of you're making the whole thing happen. You're responsible for this, for the service design process happening. Maybe you're responsible for hosting the workshops and focus groups or meetings that happen as part of that process. Is it that you're participating in that process as in a sort of professional capacity? So you're bringing your lived experience maybe of delivering the services, so the blue area here. Or is it that you're participating in that process as someone who's bringing their lived experience of using the services? And what we might see here is that there's a bit of a power differential as we move down this list. And in order to share our power, I think it's really, really important first to recognize where and acknowledge where we have it. And some of the things we might think about when we think about, well, what power do we hold? And this is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are so many factors here, but we can think about things like our titles. Sometimes even just the way we introduce ourselves can give people a specific impression of us or how much power we hold. It's important to think about what access to time and resources do I have, and that often goes along with our job. And I think we can't really talk about this without talking about, well, who's being paid for their time to be there. And we could host a whole hour-and-a-half conversation about the importance, as well as the challenges around making sure that people who bring lived experience expertise into these spaces are remunerated, rewarded, recognized for their time. But it's not always the reality, and it absolutely impacts the power dynamics. We can think about what decision-making power we have, and we can think about whether we're part of any marginalized groups, and if so, to what extent are those groups represented in the space that we're in. But again, this isn't an exhaustive list. So if we go back to our sort of different roles within this participation triangle, the first one I'm going to speak to is the service design coordination role. And that's not to say that has to be a role title verbatim, and it's quite unlikely that it is, but it's just to say that you're responsible for making it all happen. And I've brought back the spectrum because I think it can be so helpful here. Because yes, absolutely, we should be striving towards working in more collaborative and empowering ways. But that's not always within our gift, and it can be quite tricky to be in this sort of in the middle role where we're trying to facilitate that process, but also the decisions maybe aren't ours to make. So depending on what's been promised in terms of like decision making, we might find that we can't promise people that will be collaborative because they won't be involved in making the decisions. And it might be that we don't have time. Collaboration, like meaningful collaboration, it takes time to build trust, to form relationships, to have nuanced conversations. And the other thing is like resources to do this stuff well. We talked a little bit about accessibility before the break, but to do these things well, we do need resources to make sure that what we're doing is accessible, because it might be that we need to pay for people's transport. It might be that we need to pay for translation. It might be that we need to pay for childcare so that everyone that wants to take part is able to do so. And we don't risk, only getting certain voices in the room. So it's not always within our gift to work maybe as collaboratively or empoweringly, if that's a word, as we'd like to. But what's really, really important is that we don't overpromise and don't say that we're collaborating when in fact we're not. And transparency is so important. And people will really, really appreciate you showing up to that space, being open, honest, and vulnerable. And actually, regardless of where we're working on the spectrum, It's the same best practices that apply. If you're familiar with the national standards for community engagement, that's great. If not, I'd encourage you to go check them out. But it's what I want you to take away from this, I guess, is it's not that one step on the spectrum is better than the other. It's just that we need to think about our context and our constraints and kind of pick one that works for us and our work. And the other thing to think about, I guess, in this sort of service design coordination role is considering where within that service design process are we creating space for people to input. And what you'd expect is that we might get participation at least once in the problem diamond and at least once in the ideas diamond. But what happens in between quite often is that us as the professionals or our colleagues, we take the data that we gathered and we analyze it and we synthesize it. And we are the ones that make the decisions that need to be made to move us on to the next step in that process. But things can look different and the whole process can be more empowering if lived experience is involved across the whole process. So absolutely people can be involved in making those small decisions, in even like defining the opportunity part in that data synthesis and kind of really embedding themselves in the process. But what's important to mention here is that a lot of the time we have more time to make this happen than people have time to take part. So when we do get their participation, we do bring people together in a room, it's so important that we use their time effectively if we want the best. So in this sort of coordination role, I think what that might look like is really investing the time in planning and structuring those workshops or that time in a way that decisions can be made collaboratively and in a time efficient way. And there's plenty of tools and activities and exercises out there that will help you do that. It might look like preparing information and materials for that workshop in advance so that actually the information that we want people to discuss is quite digestible and easy to pass. So just really using our capacity to make it easy to get involved so that we're really respectful of people's time. So the three things, I guess, in that coordination role for me would be thinking about the spectrum and then thinking about the double diamond, maximizing where people can get involved and how we use their time. And I'll move us on to the sort of leadership decision maker role. We spoke earlier a little bit about the constraints, but maybe if this is a role that you hold, it might be within your gift to shift where we're able to work to be more collaborative and more empowering. We often say that service design is 10% doing service design and 90% creating conditions for service design to happen. And it can be so helpful if you've got leadership sort of holding that protective umbrella over your work. So just by, I guess, advocating for these ways of working, supporting them, and really committing to the process as well as its outcomes. If this is the role that you're in, but you're maybe still not quite sure about it, or maybe not quite sure how you'd make the case for it to the other people in those spaces, there is a wealth of resources and case studies and data out there to support the impact that this kind of work can have. And you too could, I guess, play a role in adding to that database. And lastly, but I think really importantly, and Christina touched on this a little bit before the break, but when we do come together in these spaces, how do we share that space? Because we're bringing together different groups with different experiences. Even within those groups, people aren't a monolith. They will bring different experiences and different priorities. So it's important that we're able to have conversations in ways that are constructive. And obviously that responsibility to create that space mostly lies with whoever is hosting or facilitating, but as we acknowledged, there is also, different amounts of power being held by different people in the room that might be participating. So we all kind of play a role, and we need to be able to have conversations that are nuanced, that are constructive. We need to be able to work together, make decisions together, and a key factor in helping us do that is psychological safety, which is basically whether participants feel safe and comfortable contributing to the space, maybe even respectfully disagreeing with something else that was said, whether they're able to bring their whole selves and their whole experience and share things that are potentially quite vulnerable. So I've done enough talking here, and I wanted to just pause for a second to see whether you've got any ideas or any ways that you might have done this in the past. So we're thinking about how we can create psychologically safe spaces, and we've maybe got time for a couple of people to put their hands up and share, or if you'd like to put any ideas in the chat, and it can even be just an idea or something you've done in the past. I need to take a little bit of a break from talking. Okay, we've got group agreements in the chat. Perfect. That's really, yeah, a really good one. Mentee polls, yeah, so a way to get everyone involved. I think with group agreements, I always say that it's so important to make them, and if you can make them together with people, great, but I think it's even more important to stick to them, because I've been in so many sessions where people make a group agreement and then someone's clearly not respecting the agreement, but nothing is done about it. So I think that one always comes with a caveat for me. Alexis, you've got your hand up.
I do. Hello. I suppose this comes sort of sorry, there's an absolute racket coming from the meeting room next door, if you can hear that. This sort of follows on from the point about group agreements. I suppose for those people in the room who maybe have organised the session or are taking like the sort of facilitator role, having that discussion beforehand about what the approach should be if there is a disagreement, if somebody's not respecting the group, and actually knowing what the kind of steps are and what you've agreed to do that beforehand, because I think otherwise you could be in the situation where either you might feel like I can't challenge that because I'm not entirely sure how to do it. So making sure you've kind of, I don't mean assume the worst and plan for the best, but you know what I mean, like sort of acknowledge the possibility that something might go, somebody might say something that somebody else finds offensive or unhelpful, there might be a disagreement. So kind of have your strategies ready for the difficult bit of facilitation and supporting people to get involved.
Yeah, being prepared so it doesn't catch you out and you're able to respond in a way that's constructive. And we've got other things in the chat. We've got showing vulnerability and admitting where you've made mistakes before, leading with honesty and openness. Don't assume vulnerability sits only with lived experience. Absolutely. First names, roles and titles, not the key elements. Perfect. Yeah, lots of great ideas. I'm conscious I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to show you my last slide, which is one I prepared earlier, and you've touched on lots of these points. We've done group agreement. We talked a little bit about, and I think, yeah, the last comment in the chat mentions roles and titles. Absolutely. Language, I think, goes with that as well. Sometimes our language can other people. I've got creating space for everyone to contribute, and actually when they do, making sure we value those contributions. Moving at the speed of trust, we talked a little bit about that, not assuming people will come into a room full of strangers and share things that are vulnerable, and hand-in-hand trauma-informed approaches. Ensuring everyone's needs are met, and I guess this goes with like hospitality, just making sure people have access to water, maybe snacks, they know where the toilets are, and they can really feel comfortable in the space. Modeling vulnerability and being genuine, which is absolutely what's come up in the chat quite a lot, because people will know when you have a wall up, and it actually goes a really, really long way if you're able to bring yourself into a space as a facilitator in a way that's genuine, vulnerable, open and honest. And the other ones I have like a sharing information in accessible formats, and again, we talked about that, and it might be about the meeting itself or about what's going to be discussed, and making space to make those decisions together. But I'll leave it there. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but I'll pass over to Christina to talk a little bit about one of the ways that this was approached in practice.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah, so during the mental health and wellbeing work that we did with Fife and Health and Social Care Partnership, obviously we addressed all these ways to make it accessible for people, how to create a fair and equal space that we're in. Lots of stuff came up, such as venue choice, acoustics, accessibility, where it was. And one thing that we were really quite proud of that was co-produced by people with lived experience was a self-care leaflet. And we did this because, and this is a personal experience of my own, and I'm sure it's happened to many others, often in these conversations that I'd been in as a volunteer, not as a paid staff member, sometimes I felt like I was being singled out as needing extra support, and sometimes that could just work against the trust that's already been built. I think it's important to trust that, like I say, trust the people that are coming into this space and sharing their vulnerability, whether it's from a lived experience point of view or whether they're in a leadership role or a professional role. So in order to sort of address that, we, on all the tables that we had people around, we handed out leaflets to everyone. We give every single participant a little pack, and whichever area we were in, we also had a tailored version. So we visited Cowdenbeath, North East Fife, and Leavenmouth, and each one had a tailored one with support and services that were in that area, and the overall one for self-care. And I think that self-care is just important anyway when you're taking part in these types of conversations, regardless of what perspective you're coming from. And as pegs, as if we've talked about this before, pegs, don't assume vulnerability only sits with lived experience participants. That is so important. Sometimes it is the professionals that might find these sessions hard, because it is hard to hear that maybe people aren't getting the support that they actually need, and they're heading up departments or whatever it is. So yeah, this was just one of those ways that we try to address that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. I think it might be over to me next, but yeah, like when we were chatting about this, I was sharing with Christina one of the first sessions I ran. There was somebody from DWP who actually left the room crying, and this was me being a total numpty in my first ever collaborative conversation. I've learned a lot since then. But actually, that brings me on to one of the key points that I want to make about the qualities and conditions that support service design, which is, if you're taking this forward, you will get this wrong as many times as you will get it right. And if there is one thing that you can do, is bring that humility and that willingness to learn and an openness to the journey of work, because it is a journey and it is learning, and every conversation, every service design program, every engagement will be utterly unique depending on the individuals and whoever's in the room. So kind of bringing that openness is and a learning a learning mindset is critical. The following conditions are just things that actually came up, and some of them are things that we learned through our original No One Left Behind work in Fife, and we kind of pulled together ourselves. But they've also been reinforced by some work I've been doing around research and co-production and the qualities and conditions that support this kind of work. And I use co-production and service design interchangeably, so I apologise about that for people who care about getting the language right. But for me, you don't get meaningful service design if you're not doing it in a co-produced way. So I guess I'm not going to apologise for that too much. So some of the things that are really important, one is this thing about authentic leadership. So that's about these qualities that we got on the right, about willingness to learn, curiosity, humility. But within that, there's this leadership thing, which is actually about balancing messiness with action. If you look at that original sort of squiggle, we've got beautiful theory around service design, but actually it gets very, very messy. And for everybody involved, professionals and people who are coming from a lived experience perspective, that can get very unsettling and quite difficult. And one of the things, as somebody who's facilitating that, you can do is to just be really clear about what the next steps are, just be really clear about the arc of the journey without necessarily pinning down where the end line is, but actually kind of helping people feel that there is a safe container and that there is momentum even while you're sitting in the messiness, particularly that problem end of the spectrum, because everybody really hates that bit. We don't like spending time thinking about problems. We like spending time thinking about solutions. There's something about this ability to really value disagreement as an important part of the process. One of our colleagues in Fife once says, if you're not uncomfortable, we're not doing it right. So, if you're not being put into a position where you're having to question your assumptions about what's working and what isn't and how things could or should be, then probably something isn't going okay. You're not really hearing different perspectives. But that also asks something of us as individuals, which is our ability to manage or understand our defense response when that happens. And again, as a human, as myself, I know now, after many years, that if I respond very strongly, if I have a very strong defense response to something, it's highly likely that somebody's hit a real nerve and they've probably said something really accurate and just very deeply painful. But there's something that we need to bring as humans into this space, which is our own understanding of that and our emotional awareness and savviness. This stuff doesn't work with a lack of trust. It's very crucial. The time spent building and maintaining relationships is absolutely foundational to having successful and meaningful service design work. And I think I undervalued that when I first started out on this journey, because I'm a bit of a do person. Again, that comes on to the point about time, but also the point about physical space, taking these engagements out of our public sector or settings, moving into and towards communities.
Right. So Caroline, yeah, she's been involved for years.
Somebody's accidentally unmuted. Oops, I remuted him. There we go. Yeah, and think about Christina touched on actually the physical comfort of a place. I remember one of our lived experience team colleagues saying one engagement, he said, I've sat on more comfortable bricks, you know, just like really it matters. And then finally, thinking about this, understanding individual resistance. Now that might be within ourselves, but it also might be with our colleagues, with our peers, with leaders, because it will encounter resistance. And you know that I think all the research shows that, and that's because we're moving into a way of doing things differently, and that thing about power and control and who we are and what we do, and you know, so I think just acknowledging that resistance is a part of the journey and understanding that is a really important thing to think about. So we wanted to take a little minute. Oh yes, sorry, I forgot about that one. We'll leave that slide. We'll skip. Yeah, this slide is just from the amazing Beyond Sticky Notes book, which Maja, Christina, myself, and anybody else who's been involved in this work will rave to you about. So just go and read the book. We would love to hear from you if there that you have learned here that has been new, or maybe that has surprised you. You again, just going back to kind of just using either the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand, that's also wonderful. And just you can take a moment to do that if you like. I'll maybe see people's hands. Was this all stuff that you all knew already? You're just like, yeah. Is this validated things that you already knew?
Can I add a little reflection?
Yes.
Because there's things during the session in my little piece about my story, I get carried away on certain points. But I also make observations like in real time. And two that I've made are, one, sort of related to service design, but because of PEGs, I then met Maja, who we then worked together to be able to come up with our parts of the presentation. And that's so important when dealing with service design and collaborative conversations. Is it might not be a finished project, it might just be a new connection, it might just be a new piece of learning. And I don't think any session has in the history of workshops failed in any way, because regardless again of the outcome, you've taken something from it, whether it works or not. And also I've put down, intentionally or not, Pegs did sort of trust me and Maja to be able to work sort of out with her. And that's just a testament to like that type of culture that has been in my working life with her. Yeah, that if that makes any sense to anybody.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I think that's true. And there's something about the power of connections, isn't it? And what can grow from those things. A couple of people have Mark's mentioned about the concept of prioritizing condition building. Yeah, absolutely. Like, and we've been in situations where that hasn't been prioritized, and the change in the experience is notable. So I think everybody would emphasize how incredibly important that is. Yeah, moving at the speed of trust is a lovely concept, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there's Jane's popped in the chat. In case people don't spot it, there's a little reevaluation in the chat. We're always keen to get people's feedback on these different sessions. So please do let us know what you've liked, you know, anything you think about that we could have done better, or for future sessions that might be useful. I've popped my email in the chat. So I'll go on to talk about resources because I think maybe that's a useful place to go. So there are, I mean, it can be a bit overwhelming. There are loads of places to go. There is Employability Service Design Toolkit, which is produced by Scottish Government, which you know, may be useful to people. There's the Co-Production in Scotland Network, which have lots of useful information, and they also run like ideas clinics. So I was at one with Maja earlier this week. It's a great place to hear about struggles and challenges. Local authorities come along, as well as third sector organisations. It's a real mix of people just trying to work out how to do this work well. Struggles to Strength is about trauma-informed approaches that came out of work in Fife. Iris have lots of tools about kind of that can be useful to do service design work, as does the Promise Design School. I think there's the Service Design Academy. They do training, supported the work in Dumfries and Galloway. And also Thempra, so myself and Christina and numerous colleagues have been on their Making Co-Production Meaningful course, which I think we would both highly recommend as a really good, yeah, a good course. I have put my contacts in. We have set up a service design and employability community of practice. If you want to be added to the mailing list with that, then please come along. And also I can put you in touch with colleagues in the case studies that we shared, if you you know, if you want to follow up on a particular one. If we go to the next slides. Back. Don't know what happened there. Yes, so on here we've got the link to Beyond Sticky Notes, the website, and the book. We all recommend it. Just go there. Click onto the next one. And the next, because those are right. If you can do various numbers of clicks, because my attempt to do clicks didn't really work very well. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 should do it. Yes. I just wanted to end by coming back to where we started, which is how this work can support the No One Left Behind key principles. And I began by saying it was about kind of this principle about, you know, what we do being informed by the experience of users. But actually, when you look at what can come out of a service design approach, it really will hit all of those boxes about dignity and respect, fairness and equality, taking a continuous improvement mindset to what we do, making sure we're really commissioning person-centered support, that people can navigate and find their way through it. I would actually say it supports integration and alignment. And Christina herself said that she also feels that it really can help that point about supporting people to find the right job in the right time. So, you know, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer. I hope people feel inspired to just start their journey. Start small, make mistakes, learn, and remember that there's a community of support out here that really want to help and go with you on that journey. So yeah, I don't know if Christina and Maja, you have any last words you'd like to say. Other than that, we'll kind of.
I just put a little bit in the chat about the importance of transparency. When especially service design, like the people that are at the top sort of making these strategic decisions, say you have no idea where this is going to go. Say I'm really sorry, but we don't know if it's going to go this way or that way. The next steps are it now goes to this board, and it's out of our hands there. I think just a little bit of honesty there goes a long way, and you realise that the services are trying to open up that trust again. Because I think throughout the last, 20, 30 years, there's been a huge lack of trust in public services and in all services, private, public, third, and that honesty really, really helps.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christina. I'm aware we're over time, so it just falls to me to say a huge thank you to Maja and Christina for sharing your knowledge, insight, and experience. Everyone else for coming along and being part of this learning journey. I hope you have found it useful. And hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you at some of the future sessions, which Jane has also popped in the chat, but they'll come out to you with the PowerPoint. So come along and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.